Hi, good afternoon and welcome to the Vision interview section of today's program. Joining me is Sam Herbert. He's going to be my guest this afternoon for this segment of the program. Sam is co-founder and CEO of 67 Bricks. Prior to founding 67 Bricks some 15 years ago, Sam held a variety of leadership positions in scholarly communications. So to kick things off, Sam, I'd like you to briefly describe what 67 Bricks is, what it does, for those of you who are not familiar with your company.
Will do. Thank you. Nice to be with you. Yeah, 67 Bricks. We are a software development consultancy. So essentially, we build technology systems, and the kind of systems we build help publishers become data-driven product companies. And we're really focused on those products being compelling user experiences. And we provide technologists and publishing consultants as a team to build those products for those publishing organizations.
Yeah, great. And so as we've been talking about throughout the day, user experience and usability is an important thing that institutions should be focused on. What are some of the key business considerations publishers face when thinking about improving these usability and user experience issues?
Yeah, good question. I think that most publishers understand that usability is important, but one of the questions they have to ask themselves is how much control do I actually have over the platform where my content is accessed, and how much can I actually change that user interface? So that's a real difficult business question to ask themselves when they've got significant technical debt, or their platform is hosted by a third party, or it's aggregated content. Another consideration, I think, is kind of who are our users? And as anyone knows who's built any kind of technology system, you have to prioritize. And so who do we focus on? Whose user cases and user goals are we really going to try to deliver against? And that's an important question for organizations, for publishers who have lots of stakeholders. They have, internal stakeholders, they have librarian stakeholders, they have the end consumers of the content are also stakeholders, and to think about who are we going to prioritize and who are we really going to focus on delivering an excellent user experience for is really important. And then I think once you start to think about that question, then it becomes about the practicality. So how do we engage with our users effectively, and what people and skills do we need to do this? Then we're getting into all the questions around what is the process and what kind of questions should we ask, open or closed questions, do you ask people what they want, or do we show them something? And that's the kind of moving into more of the practicalities. But what we talk to publishers about at the moment is really the realization that they have to become digital product companies, really. Historically, it's been pretty set in stone. If you're publishing text, then how you deliver that text was through a printed journal, and that structure and format of that journal was very set in stone. So that was easy. That was a solved problem for you. But now, in the digital environment, you really have to start to think more about considering your offering as a product, and a digital product, and therefore, all the questions arise around, what do users want? How do they want to access that content? What are their end user goals? And the reality is there that we have to talk about publishers becoming more agile, more flexible, and getting more control over what they can change. At the moment, I think the weight of decision making is currently very heavy, because if you're putting a request for a change for a UI element in, and it's going to take 6 months, or it's going to cost a lot because you've got a large technical debt, then you're very cautious. And I think that really impacts our industry at the moment. So what we talk to organizations about is really the need to become more agile organizations, to go through the digital transformation process so that they're in a position where they can make multiple changes on a weekly basis. Once you get to that kind of situation, then the weight of that decision becomes much less. And you can actually say, well, we've had this feedback and we can react on it very quickly. Let's put it out there and see what happens. And then we can start to look at the data, and we can start to get that qualitative feedback from people. And we can get to a point where we're very quickly reacting to that. And then if it didn't work, 1 week later, 2 weeks later, we can change it again. But in the current situation, the current environment is a much more difficult environment where that isn't possible. And if you're going to make a change, and it might be up there for 6 months, you've got to be very much more conservative about the kind of changes you're going to make.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that kind of goes to the notion of, and maybe this is one of those things that's kind of outlived its usefulness in terms of our approach to how we build systems, how we support systems, and not doing so in a user-centered way. Do you think that's part of an underlying problem of the community not prioritizing the user experience and usability in UI design?
Yes, I think a short answer to that is yes. I think that I think there is an underlying issue within our community, and it's understandable, and you can kind of see why it's happened, because for so many years, so many things were set in stone. You didn't have to ask those questions. How are we going to deliver this content? Well, that's decided. And what format should it be in? And how regularly should we deliver it? All of those things were kind of set in stone. So we weren't geared up as an industry to think more iteratively about what is important to the user, and actually also for a long time, the end consumer or the different stakeholders weren't seen as that important, funnily enough, in our world. Whereas with things like open access and other, and with more data about usage and librarians having more access to how much content, which pieces of content are actually being used and which aren't, there's a shift happening in terms of the power and the importance of the user becoming more central. But historically, I'd say, that we definitely haven't paid enough attention to those users. But I think most publishers now are getting to the point where but only now perhaps, where they realize how important usability is. For a long time, I think we thought, and publishers have thought, well, it's just the amount of content and the quality of the content that you produce that's the only important thing. But in a world of content overload, that just doesn't make sense anymore. That isn't the only important thing. And I remember even someone at the BMJ, one of the world's most prestigious producers of content, telling me that, well, it's no longer just the quality or quantity of the content. It's about things like speed of access and the usability of that content that determines whether they actually use our content or not. Because their content may be in multiple locations, in multiple places, not necessarily that they would want that, but that is the reality. But also that other people are producing content that's similar to theirs, and they realize that people will go elsewhere, even if the quality is not quite as good, if they can get it quicker or easier or simpler. So yes, I think we have historically not paid enough attention, and we do need to pay more attention. I think we've done, but we shouldn't be too hard on ourselves, because we've gone through a whole phase of digital transformation. We historically have done a really great job of taking all of this offline content and putting it online, and that was a really big deal, and it has dramatically increased the ability for a wider group of people to access content. But in doing that, we didn't really ever ask any of the big questions like, is this the right user experience in an online environment? I think we simply moved to a print online environment. We recreated that print environment online, and that was a really important step. But I think we need to understand that that was the first phase of digital transformation, and we need to go through the second phase, which is asking some of those big questions, like what are our underlying, what are our users' underlying goals beyond simply reading text, because that isn't enough of an understanding.
Yeah. Yeah, as you were describing this, I was thinking, I did a presentation earlier this month at the APE conference about digital content, and it sounded so much like we took the printed page, we publishing industry, we designed the page, and we present that user the page in a PDF form, and yeah, it's digitized, which is not necessarily taking full advantage of this digital experience, which is so much more than text on a page.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Are, do you think there's something more than that mindset, that kind of skeuomorph mindset, that is inhibiting our progress and growth in building better user experiences?
Yeah, there's a few things, I think. The first one, and the one that we always come up against and people talk to us about, is I kind of mentioned it earlier, but the use of off-the-shelf platforms or content aggregators, or their actual ability to control the platform that they're delivering that content through. So quite a lot of those platforms were designed for that first phase of digital transformation and were really important in supporting publishers to do that. But now you're in an environment where you want to say, I want to do something very specific for my users. I've got my users are chemists, and chemists really care about chemical structures. And if I'm going to deliver a really good search experience for a chemist, then basing it on a kind of out of the box search technology just isn't going to cut it. Well, it isn't going to add any value beyond what Google already does. So why would they come to you? Why would they use your interface? So that's a really big blocker for a lot of organizations, where they are in a situation where they are asking for what you might consider relatively small changes, and the challenge, then they just can't get those changes made, or it takes many months to get those changes made. So that's often for us the one of the biggest blockers that they're coming up against, in terms of how do I deliver a better user experience, how do I do something better. So, and then sometimes they've also got their own, maybe they do have their own internal platform, but there's a lot of technical debt around that, and then you've got culture as well. We've touched on culture a bit already, I think, but there's also a culture of not experimenting. You don't experiment with a printed page. You can't print 100,000 journals and editions and then retract them a week later. So we have to change our, so it's a combination of technology, culture, and people that has to change to support this. And these are where the kind of blind spots are. We should definitely not underestimate the cultural challenges as well that are inherent in our industry.
Yeah, that's so true. Yeah, like back in the day when we were earlier in our careers, you'd have a print run of several 100,000, and you wanted to make sure that it was absolutely correct because you couldn't pull it back. Although sometimes you could, and it would be horribly expensive. And yeah, I remember my sister was editor of this class yearbook, and a profanity ended up in the yearbook. So she had to go through with a Sharpie marker and mark it out of every one of the 500 copy.
Yeah, so if you've experienced that in some form in your career, you're really not going to be comfortable with an environment where someone's, a developer or a product owner from a different industry comes along and says, yeah, let's just try this. Like, no, that doesn't work. You can't do that. You can't release a minimum viable product. That no one will accept that. And there's some elements of truth in there, but the reality is that's the direction we have to go in. Amazon does I can't remember the number, but I think it's over 100. At any one time, they're carrying out more than 100 experiments, and they're constantly checking those and getting the data on them and evaluating them. And we don't want to be on that scale, but at least if we were doing 1 or 2 experiments at any one time, that would be a great start.
Yeah, exactly. So if I'm in an organization that isn't engaged in user experience testing, or maybe I'm at an organization that's interested in raising the bar in my services usability, where should I start?
It's a really good question. And I think, well, the obvious answer, I guess, is to start with the user. But there's some I guess there are some specifics there. I think the end goal is to put the user at the center of any development work. And there are really good processes and really, lots of established kind of procedures for making that happen. But I think a really good place to start is getting to know some of those users. And that may sound obvious, but in different organizations, there's a different level of understanding with end users. I used to work at a charity, a cancer research charity, and we actually built a charity fundraising site that was around donating in memory of someone. And having built that site, people then started to share stories about the people who had died of cancer. And actually that got us, as a development team and a project team, very, very close to those end users in a very real way, because we were starting to read some of those stories about these people who, and so I think whatever way your organization needs to do it, start by making a connection, getting an understanding of who these users are and what do they really care about. And then I think the next step beyond that is to really understand, what do they do? We're very good at starting with our product or our content and saying, we've got, we go to users and say, we've got this platform, what do you like about it, or what don't you like about it? And they will answer that question. But the more important question is, what do you do in your day-to-day life? And at what point do you touch our content? And and to actually have them talk through in a process, this is what I do. This is, let's say I've got a task of I'm trying to find a new research partner to do some new scientific research. Let's talk through how you currently do that. And you go and you talk them through it. It might be a 5-step process. It might be a 30-step process. And you walk them through it and you understand it. And through that, you'll start to realize, the reality of how good your platform is. When do they use it? Why do they use it? And then that will be the best way of prompting ideas for the improvement of the services that you provide, rather than starting with, starting with yourself. Start with them, and then I think, and then it's a kind of a rolling evolution from there. Once you start, you've really got to then continue to put the user at the center of the organization, and then all those decisions that come around that about, you need to hire, you probably need to get either hire or get people involved who have some usability experience. You need to engage or work out how you can have a more flexible and agile technology environment. One of the things that I think everybody who works with digital products should do at some point is to actually watch some user sessions and actually watch users using your platform, your lovingly designed, your perfectly designed interface. And I remember doing this very early on when usability was a new thing, and there was a big button in the middle of the page which was, maybe it was donate, and the task we'd asked them to do was to donate some money, and they're like, I can't see how to do that. No idea. And it's like, why can't you see it? And but they're not the ones who are wrong. that's the reality you have to get to, is that they are never wrong. and going through that process is absolutely illuminating in terms of how simple you need to make things for people.
Yeah, the customer is always right.
Absolutely.
We talked a little bit about some of the success stories that you've done at 67 Bricks. I mean, but can you take us through like maybe some details about what you've done with one of those partners who you've associated with,
Right.
and what are some of the things that helped them achieve the success that they had?
That sounds good. Yeah, so I think Emerald's a great place to start. So for Emerald Publishing, they were really thinking about how do we differentiate ourselves. In a world of content overload, in a world where lots of different publishers are publishing similar content, how do Emerald create a unique position in the market? And they came to the conclusion they really needed to think about usability and user experience, and they needed to deliver a better user experience for their users. So we helped them, and they were really struggling with their current platform, because they had a list of things they wanted done, and it was taking many months for those things to be achieved, and they weren't really very high on the priority list, I don't think. And they had different business cases, different business models they wanted to try, and they could never really, it was a real struggle to get those launched. So we helped them by providing much more flexibility and agility to respond to user feedback. But what they did was they engaged a group of partners. I think these were primarily librarians from the organizations that they delivered content to. And that was a really important part of the process, and it was part of both the development process. So prior to launch, there was lots of work done with these organizations, and that was really important in making sure that they felt it included, but also that obviously the UI was good and useful for them. But just as importantly, that work continued post-launch. And so you launch a new platform, and quite often the scenario is that you then leave it for 6 months or a year or 2 years, and you assume the work's done. But with modern digital products, you really need to, the really interesting work, the really kind of beneficial work typically starts after launch. So we worked with them, and we provided we essentially were their partner, both for delivering the platform, but also in post-launch, in terms of delivering new features and new capabilities based on customer feedback as and when it came in. And I think that was a real surprise, and for both internally, that this was possible, but also for their partners. And to see their feedback being acted on meant that they thought they felt like they were being listened to, and then they provided more feedback, which was then listened to further, and it actually kind of rolled and delivered better and better user experience. And that platform won usability awards, and it was referenced when they won the Independent Publisher of the Year award as well, in I think a couple of years ago, which is very exciting. Another example, which is interesting and a slightly different approach, but also very successful, was with rebuilding the De Gruyter's platform. So the headline is, within the first year since launch, the platform has doubled the amount of content that has been accessed, and doubled the number of users. And there we were, following the agile process, and we really focused, on all aspects of usability. Again, things like search results being really important, and really understanding how they need to be good for their end users, but also search result speed. If you're an end user, that's a really interesting, important part of usability, is how quickly does this site respond to me. And if you're even having to wait 3, 5, definitely 10 seconds, then you're not going to do many searches. And whereas if you're getting sub-second search results, then you can use it in a very different way. You can start to adapt and change your search as you get different results back, and you can start to play with it and use it as a much more useful tool. So huge success there by following that process. And they engaged us, but also they engaged a usability designer to support that process. So I think really from our perspective, usability doesn't come in individual moments. I mean, there might be individual moments of kind of, oh wow, I've just realized that the fact that that button is there in that shape doesn't work. But it's really about many small decisions, and it's building a process that allows that. So you have obviously the user at the center of it, but also you have small groups, and you trust those small groups of people to act on and deliver against end user objectives. And that's something that we need to do as publishers, is get more is move away from command and control and move much closer to an environment where we are trusting small groups of people to work together and to be intelligent and to come up with good solutions to those kind of usability challenges that we come up against.
Yeah. So an interesting question for you. There's kind of a tension here in the usability, the kind of instant feedback, the testing, the iteration, that agile development approach, and a longer term vision. So this is a model for what we do today, but how do you keep this going and think about like a 3 to 5 year time horizon in your product development, in your processes? How do you mix the short-term immediate and the long-term goals and say, well, this is where we want to be 5 years from now down the road, and how do you think about the tension there?
Yeah, well, I think that question about 3 to 5 years down the road is a really important one for lots of organizations and actually individuals within our industry. I think we need to understand that we are in the middle of a period of dramatic change, and I think that every industry is going through digital disruption, and it's no different for the information sector. So actually, I think we're in a situation where we don't know what things are going to look like in 3 to 5 years' time. So the answer comes back to if you're not going to be certain, and you need to make bets, and you need to kind of align yourself in a specific direction, but you're probably doing it with less certainty than you have in the past. So how do you deal with uncertainty? Well, I think it's about building an organization that has more agility and more flexibility. And so rather than saying, well, we know we're going to be here in 5 years' time, I think probably the one certainty we can say is we know that in 5 years' time things are going to be different, and they're going to be changing just as rapidly in 5 years' time as they are now. So what do we need to do about that? Well, we need to be able to change more quickly. We need to have more agility, more flexibility. So we need to build that into our organization. And I think that's so. If you asked a taxi cab driver 5-10 years ago, is anything going to change in your lifetime? And they'll probably say no. And then Uber came along and changed everything. But I think, bringing it back to the conversation for today, what really interests me about that dynamic, about that disruption, is that those organizations, the likes of Uber and Amazon and Google, they're not delivering against new user outcomes. What they're doing is they are delivering existing user outcomes, but they're doing it better or quicker or cheaper. So it really comes back to user experience. So if you think about Uber, the end customer still travels from A to B. So they are achieving exactly the same outcome with Uber as they did with a taxi cab driver who would just pick you up off the street. But Uber was able to deliver a much better user experience for achieving that outcome. And the same with, say, Google, when it first started with just finding telephone number for your local company. Prior to Google, you would probably get your telephone book out and you would scour through it. You spend a few minutes looking. Oh, you found it now. Whereas with Google, it's a much quicker, simpler user experience. So what we really need to understand is that that disruption comes in the form of new user experiences in achieving those existing user goals. And what we need to do in our industry is realize that reading text in long form is not the end user goal. There's a very small number of cases where that is actually, but very small number. The question we have to ask ourselves is, why are they reading that text? And then find out a way to make that simpler, quicker, easier, cheaper. So for example, I've touched on it. So let's say, for example, the reason the user is looking at 100 different research articles is because actually they're trying to identify the best lab method for their particular experiment. Now, reading 100 research articles to find that out is one way of doing it. But if we think about disruption and we think about what Uber did to the taxi cab industry, a much simpler way to do that would be to, well, we actually know a lot about that user already. They're probably an author. They've probably authored a number of papers. They're probably a researcher who's done some, or maybe they just can actually just, maybe we know enough about them already to know what kind of experiment they might be doing, but perhaps they need to tell us. And maybe they just tell us, well, I'm doing this experiment. And then we can, well, because we've got all the text, we've got all the data associated with that text, we can text mine that data and that content to pull that all out for them. And then we could actually be a much simpler way of them finding out that answer. And they could say, I'm looking at the best way to separate these two compounds. And we could say, well, these are the 5 examples we have of lab methods that can do that. This one has been highly referenced. This one's been covered in 15 different articles. And that goes for the end user from being maybe it's a couple of days of work, maybe it's only even half a day's work, down to a 10-minute job. And we've dramatically increased the value. So I think we need to think about, in that journey, 3 to 5 years, we need to extend out our view about usability to user value, and ask ourselves, what is it how can we provide more value for them based on the kind of the core unique assets that we have as an organization to give them. And as publishers or librarians, we have substantial interesting assets to answer some of those really interesting questions that will achieve some of those goals that our users are trying to achieve, and doing it much quicker and simpler, easier, faster, or better is a really is a way to ensure our survival, that we continue to be the people who are helping them achieve those outcomes, and someone else isn't coming along and doing that for them. So I think in terms of that 3 to 5 years, I think we shouldn't and we can't at this point say, well, it's definitely this is the thing that's we should put all our money on. But I think what we can do is go on a journey, an iterative journey towards understanding better our users, and then getting closer to them, and then delivering better on their end user goals, to a point where in the future we are able to continue to deliver their user goals in the best way that we possibly can.
Well, I think that's a good place to draw things to a close. Focusing on the goals and the values and a process to get us there. If we can't tell the future, at least we can identify what we can do today and how we can manage that process moving forward. So with an eye towards, how are we organizationally contributing value to that process? So Sam, this has been a fantastic conversation. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. It's been really good talking with you. Really interesting conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. So we'll draw this session to a close and head back into the main room. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Bye-bye.